I need you to understand that colonialism is not the presence of white people in your country. Colonialism is not the presence of foreigners in your country. The coloniality of power is a mentality that you accept your assigned place as a dependent in the global division of labor and a provider of raw materials, incapable of designing technology, incapable of creating power and wealth, incapable of becoming a competitor, incapable of ending your own poverty without that external help, incapable of creating knowledge that's alternative, knowledge that's independent, incapable of taking knowledge that you've been given and applying it for your own emancipation. The coloniality of global power is related to teach a man or a woman to fish instead of giving them a fish. And many of you have heard me say, well, that depends on whether there are still rivers or the rivers have been dried up by climate change and overconsumption. So it won't matter whether you are teaching me how to fish or giving me a fish. There is no way to do either. And this is where we are, and welcome. Now, I need to say this because if you look at transforming demographics, we're told by the United Nations that the global population will reach 9.7 billion by 2050, that Africa's population will double. However, we're also told there is a fertility crisis in East Asia, in the countries we looked up to for development, which is South Korea and Japan. Some are entering negative growth rate. But there is also a similar crisis in Europe. And the estimates are that in Europe and in East Asia, the people above the age of 65 will double. Conversely, Africa's population is more youthful, becoming more technologically savvy. The racialized security framing of these demographics is what has led to the conception of black and brown babies as a threat versus a dividend. So let's strip it for what it is and not pretend that people are just making a mistake in their framing. It is deliberate. So if you listen to the far right, they say things that others who are more liberal are afraid to say. That what will happen to us because there is an invasion of the civilization quadrant. India just overtook Japan last month. And it seems to me that when you look at aging populations in Europe and in the areas I've described, they will require care work. Can somebody say care work with me? Care work. So the new global focus on care economy is not necessarily because we care that much about African domestic workers being exploited in the Middle East or being exploited in Europe or elsewhere, or African health workers that are going in droves. No, it is because the empire now has need for native salvation. And the native is not conscious of power and is unable to negotiate bilateral arrangements by which our skilled care workers can get remunerated adequately, reasonably, and decently, because we still think like recipients of aid. I'm talking to you who give money, you who receive money, you who engage for purposes of development. Your forays into the rural area have not been to build Africa's potential to become the next growth pole, but you have been fixated, and rightly so, because this is your historically assigned colonial division of labor role. You've been fixated with fixing poverty and misery. You've been fixated with fixing the fact that, you know, people are arrested, they are violated, and that's very important. Tragedy predisposition without foresight and imagination will essentially mean in the next 100 years, we'll still be fixing the problems of underdevelopment, of exclusion, and of immiseration. So I didn't come here to talk to people and say to you, oh, because USAID has exited, philanthropy must give more to the sector. Well, giving more to what? What sector doing what? Imagining what? What are those imaginations of liberation that makes our sector worthy of the policy changes that you're talking about, Minister? To use Frantz Fanon's term, each generation must discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it in relative opacity. What is this generation of philanthropists' mission? If your generation is to get more, betraying the potential of Africa to become that giant, to become a global Africa. My friends, you are scandalous echo chambers of the empire because you do not invest sufficiently in knowledge, in questioning good is good, but what is the cost of good? So I'm not saying don't do green. I'm simply saying count the cost so that when you are giving away wetlands in your country, when you are giving away large pieces of land for green energy, for carbon financing, you fully understand what the cost to your people's futures, not to current things are. I've been asked to come and talk about philanthropy and tell you that USAID has cut, it will come to 60 billion. The Dutch government is promising to cut 2.4 billion, and this will affect women and black organizations who get 0.1% to 0.35% of all foundation globally. That over 81% of black feminist organizations don't actually have enough to survive and to do their work, that African disability organizations and global disability. My friends, this is very important. But what's more important is they will stay in this position until this sector begins to do a reimagination of the economy, distribution in the economy, equity in the economy, and imagination of future economies where our people are not just participants, they are owners and they hold equity, and equity for themselves and for future generations. That's a fundamental point. You are educated so that you sound like those who educated you. Keep repeating these things, right? There's a rise of dictatorship. There's a rise of authoritarianism. You sound relevant. What else would you say if you had Harvard, Princeton, or you have to say these things because a parrot must sound like its master. But I didn't come to Africa, to Kigali, to hear you repeat cliches. I came here to ask, what is the link between Africa's natural resource wealth, Africa's philanthropy, Africa's middle class, and finding alternatives? What is the link between African taxation systems and women who provide care work, who bail out the state, get no recognition, and are treated as the poverty index measurements for every country? When does the fiscus begin to measure what the women do as a contribution to the economy? Because we know that nutrition security is related to cognitive capabilities. When do we get to doing certain things our own way? The issue is not whether or not you should get foreign direct investment. The issue is not whether or not you should get external resources. The issue is when you get external resources and you have no transformative strategy of turning your people from paupers to wealth holders, wealth owners, wealth creators, then what you are simply doing is worse than the traditional chiefs were forced to do. The colonial enterprise came and said, Chief, we'll give you sugar. And they came to some who say, we'll give you chewing gum. Just keep chewing, don't swallow it. When it finishes, we'll stop digging. They're still digging today because the chewing gum didn't finish. The chiefs died. I need you to understand that colonialism is not the presence of white people in your country. Colonialism is not the presence of foreigners in your country. The coloniality of power is a mentality that you accept your assigned place as a dependent in the global division of labor and a provider of raw materials, incapable of designing technology, incapable of creating power and wealth, incapable of becoming a competitor, incapable of ending your own poverty without that external help, incapable of creating knowledge that's alternative, knowledge that's independent, incapable of taking knowledge that you've been given and applying it for your own emancipation. The coloniality of global power is related to this. Now, I want to suggest to you that all these things are okay if the problem we are fixing is a technical problem of scarcity of funding or a funding gap. But that's not what we are fixing now. What we are fixing is a fundamental question on reimagining development and reimagining philanthropy. Ask the South Africans. They tried to do land reform to address reparative questions of the past. Where did the opposition come from? An Oval Office away from them. Why is the empire concerned about what a country with less than 70 million Africans is doing about its own history? It's because global systems are very much locally interested. Their survival depends on how we exercise sovereignty or don't over our natural resource wealth, over our human capital worth, over our ideation worth. I need you to understand this. It's not just a distinction between you and your leadership. Understand yourself as an agent of coloniality of power. At least, you know, one of the things that you must do, accept. Are you playing a good role? Yes. Were native commissioners who were registering Africans, giving birth certificates, playing a good role? Yes. But what role were they playing? Sustainable security surveillance for the colonial state to maintain its power. But did natives need birth certificate? Yes, so that they could be counted and schooled and taken to hospital. So the necessity of what you are doing is not necessarily linked to its transformative value. I think the biggest givers should be African thieves. Irungu, I just want to say, every time we arrest someone for corruption, many of you are saying, let's arrest them. Let's just go to their house. We take the Rolls Royces, we take the mansions. We then say, well, you are going to go to prison for your criminal liability, but for your moral liability, you are going to contribute to 100 schools, to 1,000 hospitals, to paying the fees there. We're still going to take back the money that you stole. But since you are creative at creating money without working, be creative in creating value amongst your own communities. The fight against corruption in Africa must go beyond its moralization. The responsibility of investors in Africa who have contributed to disease, sometimes knowingly, by how much they dump toxins in our soil and emit toxins in our air, must be linked to what is the not corporate social responsibility. What is the level of accountability for economic transformation, not creating jobs, but creating wealth for local communities, whether these are share ownership schemes or other means that work. I've come and rubbished all the things that you think are solutions, in part, not because I don't think they work. Every private sector person knows that offering scholarships, internships, works in creating some employment. You can't solve everything all at the same time. But unless you appreciate the enormity of the challenge, you'll be very complacent. Excessive complacency is what has created stasis and what has created lack of sovereign aspiration within the philanthropic sector. So I simply came to say, I respect you. That's why I asked you to celebrate yourselves in the beginning. But respect is not enough to keep freedom. Outrage is what is required to keep freedom. Outrage is not enough to keep freedom. Imagination, radical imagination, is what's needed. Performance is not enough, or radical imagination is not enough. Radical execution and implementation. But you can't implement if you don't have skills. But the biggest education for this sector is stop these pornographic visits to villages and to slums, where you come and you view in secret poverty of the people, and you go back and you write a glossy report. We're intervening. What did we do? We built 3 Blair toilets, 4 water taps. We sent 1,000 girls to school. Do something more radical. Thank you.